Welcome back. In this video we're going to talk about assemblies and constraints. So we're going to make a file, but this time it's going to be an assembly. And as I've said before, an assembly is a collection of parts. So it can consist of one part or it can consist of hundreds of parts depending on what you need. And the way you add parts to an assembly is with this place button in the top left. And you might need to click this drop down to get there. But I'm going to place my video 2 parts, and you'll notice that you can place it as many times as you want. So I'm going to place this twice, and I'm also going to place this cylinder that I made. And you'll notice now that these parts don't have any relationships with one another. They can move through each other and move very freely. We can give them certain relationships with the constraint button, which is right here. And you can also press C to access that. And we get this pop-up. And the first thing to notice is that there's 5 different types of constraints. However, we almost entirely use the first type. And within this first type, we have 2 solutions. We have a mate and we have a flush. And a mate basically lets you take 2 faces and glue them together. So for example, I can select this face and this face, and when I click OK, you'll notice that these faces are now stuck together. When I move the parts, the faces are still stuck. You can imagine that each of these faces has a plane, and those planes are now joined together. The other type of constraints, or the other type of solution, is a flush. And a flush doesn't glue faces together, but it lines them up. So for example, I can select this face, and now they're lined up. They're even like this. And now the only way these 2 blocks can move is vertically like this. If I wanted to completely lock these 2 blocks in place, I could add another flush just like this. And now we have 2 completely conjoined blocks. And all of the constraints that we just made are in the model browser under the relationships folder. They're all right here. These are all of the constraints we just made. And you can edit constraints from here. You can name them. I wouldn't recommend naming them. And you can also delete them. So I'm going to delete all of those. And I previously described constraints as they pertain to faces, but they can also apply to other parts, such as axes. For example, when I hover over this hole, this vertical circular axis thing appears. And I get the same thing when I hover over this cylinder. So if I wanted to put this cylinder right in this hole, I could select this axis, and you'll notice that we have 3 solutions this time. It's kind of like a normal, flipped, and whatever this thing is on the side. In our case, it doesn't matter which one we choose. So I'm just going to click the first one, and now we have this cylinder that is completely aligned through this hole. And say I wanted to level out the bottoms, I can add a flush like this, so now the bottom is completely flat. I could also say add this other block to the cylinder like this. And to completely line it up, I could add a flush. I'm flushing this face with this face, so the part rotates and now it's all even. Well, okay, I should also mate this to join these 2 blocks together in that way. And there's also one other part of constraints that I didn't mention, which is offsets. So if I go into my most recent constraint, I'm going to delete it. So now we have this. And what an offset does is it lets you constrain 2 faces, but with a certain distance between them. For example, I could constrain this to this, and now they're completely touch. But if I didn't want them to touch, say I wanted them to be exactly 2 inches apart, I can just type 2 into the offset, and now it's like this, just locked in place. And a similar thing applies for flushes, flush constraints. And one other thing to note with parts and assemblies is that within an assembly, each part has a file reference. That's how the assembly knows where the part is coming from. It is the file directory of each part. And you can run into certain problems if you ever change this file directory by, for instance, moving the part or changing its name. So if I save this assembly real quick, there we go. I'm going to close this, and I am going to rename the cylinder. See, I didn't like the name cylinder.ipt, and I wanted to change it to cylinder1. When I do that, and I reopen my assembly, I get this error. This is a resolution error, where Inventor cannot locate this part, cylinder.ipt. It can't locate it because we just changed its name. So all we have to do is replace the file location by double-clicking on the actual file where it's located. And you would get the exact same problem if I moved cylinder.ipt to, say, my desktop folder instead of my downloads folder. So you should be aware of that to avoid changing names or file locations, because you will get errors like that. Although most of the time, unless you accidentally deleted the part, the errors can be resolved. And that's all we have for today. That was assemblies and constraints, and we are done.